Imagine you're standing on a city rooftop at golden hour, handheld camera ready, and you're trying to decide whether to splurge on a new zoom lens or just make do with the kit. I've been there, scrolling through endless spec sheets, wondering if a $2,000 lens will actually make my photos feel more professional or just sit in my bag gathering dust. The fear of paying a premium and ending up with something that looks great on paper but falls short in real shooting situations is real. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The Sigma 2470mm F/2.8 DGDN for mount is the kind of lens that promises to be the workhorse for anyone who shoots with Leica, Panasonic, or Sony full-frame mirrorless cameras. It's marketed as a fast, all-purpose standard zoom that can handle anything from street snapshots to indoor events, but the question is whether it lives up to that promise when you actually mount it on your body and start clicking. In the next few minutes, I'll walk through the moments where the lens shines, the spots where it trips up, and help you decide if it's worth the investment for your style of shooting. First, let's talk about the type of photographer who typically reaches for a 2470mm f/2.8. If you spend most of your week covering weddings, corporate functions, or portrait sessions where you need a bit of reach and a wide aperture for shallow depth of field, you'll instantly feel the benefit of that constant f/2.8 across the whole zoom range. I tested the lens on a Panasonic Lumix S5 during a weekend wedding rehearsal. With the aperture wide open, the background blur was creamy enough to separate the bride from a bustling hallway, yet the corners stayed surprisingly tight and free of the vignetting you sometimes see on cheaper fast zooms. That kind of performance lets you keep your exposure settings consistent, so you aren't constantly stopping down when you swing from 24mm to 70mm. On the other hand, if your photography is primarily landscape or architecture, you might not need the constant f/2.8 at all. A lot of landscape shooters prefer a slightly slower aperture and prioritize edge-to-edge sharpness at wide angles. The Sigma delivers sharpness throughout the frame, even at the widest end, but you'll be paying a premium for a maximum aperture you'll rarely use. In that scenario, you could get a more affordable 2470mm with a variable aperture and still achieve the same level of detail. So, the lens is overkill for pure landscape work, but it shines when you need that extra light in low light or tight indoor spaces. Now, about the real-world handling. The lens is a bit larger than the typical kit zoom, which means it adds some front-end weight to a mirrorless body that's otherwise very compact. When I paired it with a Sony a7 IV for a day of street shooting, I noticed my hands started to tire a little faster than with a 35mm prime, especially when I was walking for hours. That's not a deal breaker for most people, but it's something to keep in mind if you often shoot handheld for long stretches. The focus motor is quiet and fast, which is great for video. I was able to pull smooth focus pulls while filming a short documentary piece, and there were no audible motor noises contaminating the audio track. One practical strength that often gets glossed over in marketing copy is how the lens handles color rendition and flare. I ran it through a series of backlit portraits and street scenes with strong sunlight. The coating does a decent job of suppressing flare, but you still get a subtle ghost when a strong light source sits just outside the frame. It's not disastrous, but it's a visual cue that you'll need to position yourself carefully or use a hood if you're shooting in high-contrast conditions. In terms of color, Sigma's lenses tend to lean slightly towards cooler tones, which can be a pleasant starting point for portrait work, but you might need a small amount of warming in post if you're aiming for a warm skin tone aesthetic. A hidden trade-off shows up when you consider the minimum focusing distance. The 2470mm focuses down to about 0.35 m, which is fine for general use, but it's not a macro lens. When I tried to capture a close-up of a wedding ring on a table, I had to step back and zoom in, which limited how tightly I could frame the shot without sacrificing sharpness. If you regularly need to photograph small details, products, jewelry, or macro nature shots, you will probably want a dedicated macro lens instead. Another point that matters for many buyers is the lens's compatibility with in-camera stabilization. The Sigma DGDN version is designed for mirrorless bodies that have IBIS, and it works hand-in-hand with the stabilization systems in Panasonic and Sony cameras. In my tests, the combined stabilization allowed me to shoot at 1/30th second at 70 millimeters in a dimly lit restaurant without noticeable camera shake, which is a practical advantage over older lenses that rely solely on optical stabilization. Let's address the